that. And I'll start with something that Charlie mentioned something about Genesis, right? The beginning of such. And I wanted to start the genesis of the clenched fist. Um, when I realized that there was a pattern, there was an initial sort of like moment, and that was when I arrived in Queens, New York from Haiti, and I realized that I was thrown into not just a new environment, but it felt like a completely different world. Having, you know, growing up in Haiti, having English not being my first language. And so all of a sudden it becomes my third language, but I'm thrown into an environment where I have to actually speak that language. And then the social and cultural norms were definitely a new language that I had to learn. And I grew up, as mentioned, in Jamaica, Queens, and this poem is titled Birth of a Clenched Fist. It's actually the very first poem in the book as well. Born in epidemic, circa 1986, Jamaica, Queens, when tiny whitecaps filled modern day cotton, moored most under a parking lot's dim cone of light. When paraded in chambers of those born to triggers was that sin which weaned father from son, tricked out the best in us. A resilient few kept from boxes, though what was left was worsted in haze on those horrid nights when what was promissory was plight was norm, and what was dealt mnemonic so strong I kept it in my mind like one rehearsing lines in an orograph for pain, a pain like bait that turned gain into the cleanest demise. When I stood to cleave it, the fight empty as cavity, the strife marked by omission, everything I saw was enemy, even my face, fair game. When one is thrown into a new environment, you sort of you go through this change, this rapid change, and I found myself trying not to be the shy, quiet, sensitive kid because the environment was calling me to be someone else. And that poem really chronicles the experience of actually practicing faces in the mirror until I no longer recognized the nice, quiet, sensitive boy until my face was intimidating enough to even intimidate me. And so it is this really strange process of going through that. And if you're wondering what sort of other things influenced that besides being exposed to a new environment, well, I mean, I grew up in Jamaica, Queens, at the height of the crack epidemic, and a lot of this was very visible. It didn't matter how old you were exposed to it. And the next poem I'm going to read, Elegy for 161st Street, really gives you a little bit of that experience as well, and how you have to develop a different skin really to get through it. And there's a line in there about, Benson and Hedges, which was a brand of cigarettes, because back then, parents could send their kids to the grocery store to buy cigarettes. And so, Elegy for 161st Street. 5 fierce years after Grandmaster Flash penned a rap about edges, you zigzagged the corners on runs for Benson and Hedges, back when the zeitgeist of the block was crack and your father had that used pale blue Pontiac he will dash the family into on Friday nights, trying to counter the myopic pull of the block's high danger of dope fiends and the debilitating euphoria in a whimsical gaze waylaid like mazes. You sat in the back seat and uttered under your breath. Why would anyone ever trade in nights under palm trees for these calm nights, for the menacing overtone of a smile without teeth? Because you've come to learn the most important lesson is to master your own gaze and strut for the days when soon enough you'd be spit back onto the same strip of block where twice a woman with eyes belonging to that dragged out and quintessential gaze proffered you an act of fellatio for $5. You were 10 years old on an errand to buy milk in a flagellous galaxy, but carried the weight of her bid on all future quests to the grocery store when the concrete sparkled like a sky full of stars under your feet. You were grateful for the drift of Friday nights when street telemetry took a back seat to the only sign of life, a magnificent breeze against your face. And this poem really, it does chronicle what it was like to be on that block. But as a young kid, I picked up on the fact that that the war on drugs was really a war on people on drugs, because the resources weren't there, and so folks were pinned against each other, right? And in that particular incident, someone looking for drug money didn't care how old the person was to proposition them. And but even that, as scared as I was as a kid, I kind of picked up on the fact like, man, that's another human being. How did they get to be like that, right? And so the fist idea really, started to formulate in my mind as I realized that a lot of these poems, as Todd, picked up the fact that, in the beginning talking about this, there's a lot of fist in this, right? And so the title poem, which was the most difficult one to write, really chronicles the idea of how the fist really manifested itself. And to help me with the process of writing this poem, I really dove into, my love of comic books and specifically of X-Men, right? And looking at how mutants are formed. And I realized that there's a strong connection between traumatic experiences and mutants, right? And so we all go through that phase, right? Different phases. The poem itself is 5 sections, but I'm not going to read all 5. I'm actually going to read 3 sections from that. But all 5 sections are labeled. First one is affliction. The second one is aftermath. The third one is metamorphosis. The fourth one is retaliation, and the fifth one is revolution. Now, you're probably wondering why 5 sections. Well, each one represents a digit as part of the fist. And I realized that being the heart of this collection, that for me to actually expose some of the trauma that was happening, I would have to go one digit at a time. And so I'm just going to give you three sections from there. My body as a clenched fist. 1. Affliction. It was a gust, no, a burst of air, that brought the coil to my hands time and again. And no matter what I did to flex, it didn't budge, and almost always brought me back to Leon walking beside me, then in once felt motion not there except for the treads of his shoes making its way down a street he didn't know was a one way, the wrong way. When he doubled back, it was clear that something cannibalized the way home. I vetted the treetops for a place to perch, a vantage point beyond the crowd that had gathered to watch the fight, but there was no fight. It was all one-sided. 7, strike that. 10, strike that. 18, strike that. 20 pairs of fists and Timberland boots bared down into the boy, and the only sight of fight in him was his body balling up like a fist to brace the rush of even more fist. What could I do? What could I have done? They had begun to also cannibalize passers-by and onlookers. I did what was customary, collected faces for the diurnal course when there'd be another way to put fear and the cheers into a vista that wouldn't involve more fist. That day never came. And when a fury this strong begins to court a young fist, when anger's calibrated with fondness for rancor, there is only one end. To fight monsters, you must yourself become a monster. 2. Aftermath. There was no sign it ever took place, no dents in the universe, no visible wounds from where the paratroopers landed their blows, no traces of Leon, no parallel bruise in your ribs or spine, just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. No physical wreckage, shards of bone, no raging fire or smoldering carcass, just an echo in your bones and veins, in the fists you pack for the day, just sun, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. No shortcuts, same streets, same trees, and you staring at yourself like the body's purpose was to harbor this universe of cavity. Wide enough to muse, maybe there was still a way, so certain there was still a way to walk away or undo what was done, but with no body, no witnesses to talk to. No Leon back at school. No sign the universe was ever disturbed except in your bones and in the loaded fist carried in your pocket. You sat in class, reviewed homework like you always did, later at recess in that odd, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun, whispering to the ball in your hands, shot taker and rebounder, because even at 13, you already knew that sometimes teeth are a gateway to the city of one's understanding, and other times they are a gate for what ails, and with no credible witness to corroborate other than your own reflections in storefront windows, the ceaseless parading of two bodies, a balancing double-barrel pair of fists, you settled in the glaring aftermath, alone, glazed in that beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. 4. Retaliation. When the body has had enough, before the recoil into a ball of dust or ash, when it is in full revolt, some of the tucked impression one tries hard to contain emerge as shakes or episodes of mania, rushing back like blood suddenly pooling in Leon's eyes 2 days before being jumped, when a near scrimmage in the hallway was squelched, thought to have died, but in once felt motion the block was rendered gridlocked. Fists over a glare, matured into markers for measuring seasons and would later be the reason why you wake up one day a bit mean and you didn't know yourself and you had new hands and had new feet, finding yourself running down the street in a rum frenzy, white moon haloed against black smoky sky, tangled in the waylaid traffic of recalls, fists over a glare, Frankie sabered into an infinite goodbye, air pressure in full distress in your lungs, dust filling gaps of motion. When the body has had enough, mind retaliates under the glaze of a perpetual and beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sun. Jejune fists turn maulers, bid Leon into a cosmic gutter, wide enough to muse that maybe he made it out from under their blows, and maybe Leon is sitting somewhere blazed, growing bald on a head once full of braids, musing on a roach and talking shit about when he schooled them suckers with a pivot, and you are remembering only what almost happened, not how your entire body commenced a tucking rotation until it became a full-fledged fist. This particular poem echoes a little bit of what Todd started to mention about writing poems about his grandparents or his dad's experience. At some point, you start to think that this happened to someone else. And you start to divide that part of yourself as a result of, the trauma. And the last poem I'm going to read is actually a poem that really chronicles that. I was not just, the only fist, involved in this. And the difficulty of writing about such experiences is, you tend to focus on your own particular perspective. But I was also aware that, my family and my friends, some of my closest friends, didn't know that some of these things had happened to me, and that I had witnessed them. And so part of this process, is our bodies bear the burden of our witnessing. And it is subtle, right? And subtle changes, and friends don't necessarily notice, or family members. And so words became a way that I navigated, the whole world. This next poem is a poem titled, and it's the last piece that I'll read, is When Lead Became the New High. It was when the streets decided that fistfights were no longer how they wanted to carry things out. And so it represented another danger, another layer, which in a way echoes the cycle that continues till this day. Having especially Black youth not necessarily being afforded the opportunities to have the mental health services that they need in their communities. And so some fight outward and others fight inwards. And so this is a poem titled When Lead Became the New High. Thank you all for listening. I know these are tough poems, but I feel like I'm amongst family tonight, and so I'm able to share these with you. So thank you for creating that space for me. When lead became the new high. It was clear when the choice of jabs was no longer how the streets wanted to propagate its math, and any plausible retribution for Leon and Frankie meant a shift into an implausible plot. Posses had lost their lure. Too many beefs to track, too many hurt feelings, too many dog claps and nights when slap boxing bled into a lush trap of fists. Then days of fists deliberately strayed and latterly gave way to triggers. A gat meant bolstered ranks, divorcing the cutthroat from the posers. Gats meant few waylaid for kicks, the pint size and meager not capable of pushbacks. Before that, one could scrap, but now a gat meant you could be your own posse. Win or lose, the block was soon on that somebody got a die tip, and it was apparent the bliss gave rise to some real gangsters who engraved best by dates by setting their clocks to breach. A crossover at the park or a prolonged gaze could bring more than bruises to one's ribs. It was clear the trek was no longer about who was next to fall or rise, but when. Thank you so much, Diane, for putting this together. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and I appreciate this.